I mean, just picture the legendary Japanese katana for a second. You've seen it slicing through the air in movies, in anime, or just resting silently behind museum
Well,
glass.
absolutely. It's iconic.
Right. And we look at that sleek, beautifully curved blade, and we instantly associate it with this kind of, I don't know, mystical, superhuman perfection. It just feels like the ultimate weapon, designed by masters who had everything figured out from day one.
Right, exactly. That's the image everyone has.
But what if I told you that iconic curve was actually just, well, an accident of chemistry? And that the dazzling, pristine swords that we worship as high art today were largely just mandatory dress code accessories for government bureaucrats.
It completely flips the script on how you view this object, honestly. I mean, the pop culture myth we've built around the katana is incredibly powerful, but it often completely obscures the actual history.
Which is crazy to think about.
Yeah, the reality is far more practical, and in a lot of ways, it's actually far more fascinating.
And that is exactly the mission of our deep dive today. We are taking a massive stack of historical and metallurgical notes spanning centuries of Japanese history to figure out what this sword really is.
There's a lot to unpack.
There really is. We're going to trace the evolution of its shape, the bizarre and frankly extreme molecular science behind how it's made, and the profound, almost spiritual artistry that surrounds it.
And to really understand how the katana came to be, we actually have to look at a time before it even existed.
Okay, so where do we start?
Well, early on, Japanese warriors didn't use a curved, single-edged blade at all. They used something called a tsurugi.
Oh, tsurugi.
Yeah, which was the straight, double-edged sword. It was heavily influenced by ancient Chinese designs. But, weapons are always a reflection of the battlefield. As warfare changes, the tools have to change with it.
Right. So what was the catalyst that started curving the blade? Because I always just assumed the curve was just the standard samurai aesthetic, like it was just a style choice.
Yeah. Not at all, actually. It was driven entirely by how the early samurai fought. If you look at the traditional elite warriors of the early feudal periods, they weren't fighting on foot, they were cavalry.
Oh, right. Horse archers.
Exactly. They were riding horses, and their primary weapon was actually the bow.
Okay, so where does the sword come in if they're just shooting arrows?
The sword was for when they closed the distance, when they ran out of arrows or things got up close and personal. They used a sword called the tachi.
Tachi. Got it.
Right. And the tachi was longer than a modern katana, and it had a very deep, pronounced curve. Crucially, though, it was worn suspended from the belt with the cutting edge facing down toward the ground.
Okay, wait, let's think about the physics of that for a second.
Yeah.
If you are sitting up high on a horse and you have a deeply curved sword hanging by your side with the edge pointing down, well, that is perfectly engineered for drawing and delivering a massive, sweeping downward strike against someone on the ground.
You nailed it. It's fundamentally a cavalry tool. But Japanese history doesn't stand still. As we move into the late 15th century, during the Muromachi period, Japan fractures into this massive, chaotic era of civil war.
We're talking about the Warring States period, right?
Yes, and the scale of combat simply explodes. You no longer have these small, structured skirmishes between wealthy, elite cavalrymen. You now have massive armies just colliding.
So the tactics totally shifted.
Exactly. Warlords are drafting thousands of everyday farmers to fight as foot soldiers, which were called ashigaru. So now you have these massive infantry formations packing tightly together, fighting with long spears and eventually early muskets.
Oh, wow. I'm just picturing these massive, chaotic infantry lines packed shoulder to shoulder. I mean, if you are a samurai on the ground in the middle of that absolute crush, having a massive, deeply curved sword dangling down by your knees suddenly seems like a huge liability.
It was a disaster in that setting.
Right, you wouldn't even have the physical space to draw it properly.
Exactly. It became incredibly cumbersome. The tachi was totally obsolete in that specific, crowded infantry environment. The warriors on the ground needed something faster, something suited for extreme close quarters.
And this is where the katana comes in.
This is where it's born. But, and this is the wild part, it didn't evolve from shrinking the massive cavalry sword. It actually evolved from lengthening a completely different, much humbler weapon.
Yeah, I was reading through our sources, and this detail stopped me in my tracks.
Yeah.
The katana evolved from the sasuga, which was literally just a short, spare knife carried by the lower-ranking drafted foot soldiers.
That's right, the backup knife. As tactics changed, soldiers started demanding longer and longer versions of that backup knife. And over time, that short blade was gradually lengthened into what we now recognize as the katana.
That's amazing.
But the length wasn't the only thing that changed. The most revolutionary shift was actually how they decided to wear it.
Right, because the older cavalry sword hung from the belt with the edge facing down, but the katana was worn thrust directly through the sash, or the obi, with a sharp cutting edge facing straight up.
Yes, edge up.
But why does flipping the sword upside down make such a massive difference?
It all comes down to response time. Wearing the sword edge up allowed for a highly specialized technique called batajutsu. Basically, drawing the sword from the scabbard and striking the enemy became one single fluid motion.
Okay, let me visualize this for you guys listening. If a sword is hanging down by your side with the edge facing the floor, you have to reach down, grip the handle, pull the sword up and out of the scabbard, raise it, and then swing it down to strike. That's, what, 3 or 4 distinct motions?
At least, yeah. It takes time.
But if the sword is tucked into your sash with the sharp edge pointing up, the exact physical motion of pulling the sword up and out of the scabbard is the exact same motion as slashing upward across your opponent. The draw is the strike.
It eliminates the setup entirely. In a chaotic, close-quarters infantry battle, there's no time to square off and get into a fighting stance. Whoever strikes first survives.
It's essentially the difference between a sniper rifle and a quick-draw revolver. I mean, the older cavalry sword is the sniper rifle. It's specialized, methodical, used from a specific vantage point. The katana is the quick-draw revolver, built for sudden, chaotic violence, where your survival hinges entirely on a fraction of a second.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. The shape of the katana and the way it was worn were born out of pure battlefield pragmatism. But how the swordsmith actually created that physical shape, that moves away from battlefield tactics and steps into a realm of extreme, almost unbelievable metallurgy.
Yeah, so we established they needed this quick-draw weapon. But I always just assumed that a swordsmith took a long piece of straight steel, heated it up in a forge until it was glowing red, and then physically took a hammer and just banged that signature curve into it.
Most people assume that, actually, but the smith doesn't hammer the curve into the blade. The blade literally curves itself.
That sounds like magic. Yeah. I mean, how does a piece of solid steel bend itself?
It comes down to the specialized steel they use, which is called tamahagane, and exactly how they treat it. Tamahagane is created in a massive smelting tub over several days, and it naturally ends up with very uneven levels of carbon.
Okay.
So the smith has to heat the steel, hammer it flat, fold it over on itself, and hammer it flat again, repeatedly.
Right. I've heard about the folding process before. The myth is always that they fold it like a million times to make it unbreakable. But the sources clarify that it's actually about purification, right?
Yeah.
They're basically trying to average out the carbon content so there aren't weak spots.
Precisely. It evens out the carbon and removes impurities. But once the smith has finished hammering and shaping the blade, it is still basically straight.
So no curve yet.
No curve. To give it that lethal edge and that final perfect curve, the smith relies on an ingenious chemical process. It's called tsukioki. They take the straight, unhardened blade, and they coat it in a wet clay slurry.
Which is normal mud and clay.
A very specific mixture, yes. But they don't coat the sword evenly. They scrape almost all the clay off the sharp cutting edge, leaving just a paper-thin layer. But along the thick spine and the sides of the sword, they pack the clay on thickly.
So you have a straight steel blade. The sharp edge is basically exposed, and the dull back edge is wearing this thick jacket of wet clay.
Exactly. Now, the smith heats the entire clay-covered blade in the forge until it reaches a very specific temperature. We're talking over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, glowing a precise shade of red-orange. And then they pull it from the fire and plunge it directly into a trough of cold water.
Oh man, that sudden temperature drop. The quench, that's what hardens the steel, right?
Yes, but it hardens it unevenly, which is the secret. Because the cutting edge has almost no clay on it, the water cools it instantly. The molecular structure of the steel suddenly locks into a highly rigid, extremely hard crystal formation called martensite.
Martensite.
Right. And this is what gives the katana its legendary ability to hold a razor-sharp edge.
Hang on, I need to push back here for a second. If you make the edge incredibly hard, that's great for slicing. But extreme hardness usually means extreme brittleness. Think of glass.
Yeah.
It's very hard, but it shatters on impact. If the whole sword was made of that hard martensite, wouldn't it just snap the first time it hit another sword or piece of armor?
It absolutely would. A sword made entirely of hard steel is fragile, and that is exactly why the thick clay on the spine of the sword is so critical. The thick clay acts as an insulator.
Huh?
So when the sword hits the cold water, the edge cools instantly and becomes hard. But the spine, insulated by the clay, cools much more slowly.
So the spine doesn't turn into that brittle martensite.
Right. It forms a totally different, softer microstructure, usually a mix of ferrite and perlite. This softer steel is flexible. It basically acts as a built-in shock absorber.
That is incredibly clever. You have a single piece of metal that acts like two totally different materials. The hard edge slices, and the soft spine absorbs the impact of the blow without snapping.
It's brilliant.
But you still haven't explained the magic trick. How does it curve?
Right, the curve. It curves because those two microstructures, the hard martensite on the edge and the softer steel on the spine, have different physical densities.
Wait, really?
Yes. When the steel transforms during that violent, sudden quench in the cold water, the edge literally expands more than the spine. The difference in density creates massive internal stress, and the metal is physically forced to bend away from the edge. The sword literally curves itself in the water.
I am still trying to wrap my head around the fact that these ancient Japanese smiths pulled this off. They didn't have periodic tables. They couldn't, look into an electron microscope to see these different molecular crystal structures.
Not at all.
They just observed the reactions of fire, water, clay, and steel, and perfected an explosive high-stakes baking recipe purely through generations of trial and error.
It is empirical science achieved through pure craftsmanship. What elevates this from just a clever weapon to a cultural masterpiece is the physical scar this process leaves behind. This intense chemical reaction in the water doesn't just make the sword deadly, it leaves a visible signature on the metal.
And that signature is what turned the katana into an object of intense artistic obsession. You're talking about the hamen.
I am. The hamen is the distinct line that runs down the side of the blade, tracing the exact boundary where the hard edge meets the softer spine. It is the visible, permanent record of the clay quenching process.
I actually want to clear up a misconception I had about this before reading the sources. When you look at a katana, you usually see this bright, wavy, frosted-looking area all along the cutting edge, and I always thought that whole frosted area was the hamen.
It's a very common misunderstanding, actually. That wide white frosted area is really a cosmetic effect called the hodori. It's created much later by the sword polisher, who uses special stones to whiten the steel and make the edge stand out visually.
Oh, interesting. So what is the actual hamen then?
The actual hamen is a tiny, incredibly intricate, fuzzy line hidden within that white area. It's the actual metallurgical boundary line. When experts evaluate a Japanese sword, they aren't looking at the fancy handle wrappings or the decorative scabbard. They study the bare steel.
They're looking for the chemistry.
Exactly. They evaluate the overall shape, which is the sugata. They look at the wood grain pattern left from the folding process, the jigain, and they scrutinize the hamen.
And our sources say that when they look closely at that hamen, they are searching for microscopic crystal particles that form right at the transition point between the hard and soft steel. And the traditional terminology for these particles is just incredibly poetic. They call them nai and nioi,
Yes.
and they translate to stars and mist.
Stars and mist. It's such an evocative way to describe molecular structure. The nai are slightly larger, individual glittering crystals. They catch the light like distinct stars in the night sky. The nioi are much finer, tightly packed crystals that look like a soft, glowing nebula or a morning mist.
I just love that appreciating, this isn't like walking up to a painting on a wall and just staring at it. You can't just set the sword on a table and see the stars and mist.
No, it doesn't work like that.
You actually have to hold the blade in your hand, lift it up toward a single light source, and physically tilt it. You have to constantly shift the angle of the blade, almost like looking at a hologram, just to catch a fleeting glimpse of those hidden crystals.
It really demands an intimate physical interaction between the viewer and the history recorded in the steel. It is a profound level of aesthetic appreciation. But, if we want a complete picture, we have to pull back from the poetry of the stars and the mist for a second.
Okay, why?
Because while we view these swords as priceless, mystical art objects today, their actual quality and social meaning fluctuated wildly based on the politics and economics of the era.
Right. We talked earlier about how the demand for the katana spiked during that massive era of civil war, the Warring States period. When you have warlords drafting massive armies of farmers, you don't have time to painstakingly evaluate the stars and mist. You just need sharp metal, and you need it yesterday.
Exactly. The swordsmiths responded to that massive demand by mass-producing cheap, low-quality swords called kazuchimono. These were essentially disposable loaner weapons. The division of labor was strict, corners were cut, and quality control was practically non-existent. They were pumping these out by the thousands.
The numbers in the sources are literally staggering. Between the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Japan didn't just arm its own massive forces. It exported over 200,000 of these mass-produced swords to Ming Dynasty China.
200,000. It was an industrial-scale operation that actually heavily influenced Chinese sword design in the process. The reality is that during the era when the samurai were doing the most actual fighting, the vast majority of katanas were cheap, mass-produced, utilitarian tools.
So that raises a huge question. If the swords used during the actual wars were mostly cheap, disposable loaners, when did the beautiful, artistic samurai swords we picture in our heads actually become a thing?
Ironically, they reached their golden age only when the fighting stopped. Eventually, the civil wars ended. Japan was unified under the Tokugawa shogunate, and the country entered a period of profound peace that lasted over 200 years, the Edo period.
Okay, so you have a massive elite warrior class who have defined themselves by warfare for centuries, and suddenly there are no wars. What does a samurai do all day if he's not fighting?
He becomes a bureaucrat. The samurai transition from battlefield killers to estate managers, tax collectors, and civil servants. And it was during this long peace that the artistry of the katana exploded. The swords from this era became much more decorative.
And the government actually forced them to keep carrying the weapons, right?
Yeah.
Like the shogunate mandated a strict dress code. If you were a samurai, you were legally required to walk around wearing a daisho, which is a matching pair consisting of your long katana and a shorter sword called a wakizashi.
Think about the striking contradiction there. You have a peacetime civil servant effectively pushing paper all day, but he is legally mandated to wear two highly lethal, gorgeously decorated weapons in his belt at all times.
Right.
The katana transitioned from a tool of survival to a pure status symbol. It was basically a badge of office.
That is incredible. The dazzling, mystical warrior swords we obsess over today, the ones we imagine cutting down foes on the battlefield, mostly come from an era of total peace. They were essentially just mandatory fashion accessories for a class of bureaucrats.
But history is full of pendulum swings. The peace of the Edo period couldn't last forever. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry and the American naval fleet arrived in Japan, demanding the country open its borders to the world. The shock of this foreign intervention threw Japanese society into total political chaos.
Right, the peace totally shatters. You suddenly have massive ideological divides, rebellions against the shogunate, and political activists fighting in the streets.
Yes. And these activists quickly realized that the beautiful, artistic, gently curved swords of the Edo period aren't going to save them. The nature of combat had changed again. They weren't fighting on wide-open battlefields anymore.
Where were they fighting?
They were conducting brutal, close-quarters political assassinations, often happening at night, indoors, inside narrow hallways, or small rooms at wooden inns.
Oh, wow. Yeah, if you were in a tight, low-ceiling hallway, a long, sweeping, curved slash is a terrible idea.
Yeah.
You are going to embed your beautiful sword right into a wooden door frame.
Exactly. You don't need a slashing weapon indoors, you need a stabbing weapon. So they ditched the artistic Edo aesthetic entirely. They demanded new swords specifically designed for this brutal new reality. These new blades, called kunodo, were much longer, noticeably straighter, and had massive, sharp points. Form-following function once again.
It just shows how the physical shape of the katana acts as a mirror for whatever is happening in Japanese society at the time. And that mirroring continues right up to the modern era, where the katana's existence becomes incredibly fraught.
The great turning point was the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century. Japan rapidly modernized and westernized its military. The traditional samurai class was officially dissolved. And in 1876, the government issued the Heitori Edict, which officially banned the carrying of swords in public.
The katana was suddenly outlawed. That must have devastated the swordsmiths.
It wiped out their entire industry almost overnight. Mastersmiths who had spent their lives perfecting the stars and mist lost their livelihoods. Many had to pivot to forging farm equipment, scissors, or kitchen cutlery just to feed their families.
But the katana does make a very dark, massive comeback during World War II, right? Because you see photos of thousands of Imperial Japanese Army officers carrying katanas.
You do, but it was a massive comeback in a highly corrupted form. To supply the millions of officers in the military, the government had to mass-produce swords on a scale not seen since the Warring States period. These World War II swords are called showato.
Okay.
But purists and even modern Japanese law do not consider them to be real katanas
Wait, why not? I mean, they look exactly the same to an untrained eye.
because they completely skipped the centuries-old extreme baking recipe we talked about. They didn't have the time or the resources to use the traditional tamahagane steel. They didn't take days to fold it. Many of them were shaped using industrial power hammers, and worst of all, they were quenched in modern oil instead of water and clay.
Oh, so no stars, no mist, no true Hammond. Just mass-produced steel shaped to look like a katana.
Exactly. And following World War II, the Allied occupation forces banned sword-making entirely, confiscating and destroying hundreds of thousands of blades. It looked like the craft might go extinct.
But it survived. Barely. Though from what the sources describe, modern swordsmiths operate under the most extreme restrictions imaginable.
Very extreme. Today, to legally forge a traditional Japanese sword, a smith must undergo a grueling, unpaid 5-year apprenticeship under a recognized master. It is incredibly demanding. But even after they earn their license, the Japanese government legally restricts them to producing a maximum of 2 longswords per month.
Just 2 swords a month. That is an intentional bottleneck. The government is essentially forcing them to maintain the highest possible artistic quality. You simply cannot mass produce them. You have to focus on the art.
It completely prevents the commercialization of the craft. But it also means that genuine, modern Japanese swords are incredibly rare and staggeringly expensive. Because of that, the global market has been absolutely flooded with cheap fakes, primarily manufactured in factories in China using modern steel alloys. The true art of the katana is hanging on by a thread, carried by a very small handful of dedicated masters.
But those masters are still pushing the boundaries even today. I was amazed to read that just recently in 2014, a modern smith named Kunihira Kawachi finally managed to recreate a specific visual effect called Midor Utsuri.
Yes.
It's this beautiful, shadowy white mist pattern that was common in swords from the ancient Kamakura period, but the technique had literally been lost to time for centuries. He spent years reverse engineering an 800-year-old molecular secret.
It's a real testament to the sheer depth of the craft. It's never just about making a sharp edge. There is always a deeper layer of mastery to uncover.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we are looking at an object that is truly without equal. The katana is a testament to human ingenuity. It combines ruthless battlefield practicality, an almost accidental but brilliant grasp of molecular physics, and a deeply spiritual level of artistic craftsmanship, all folded into a single curved piece of steel.
It embodies a profound, almost unsettling duality. And, if you want a final thought to mull over a detail from the sources that perfectly captures that tension between art and violence, we have to look at the year 1797.
Oh, what happened then?
Well, we spent time today talking about how the Japanese appreciated the microscopic stars and mist in the blade, elevating the sword to delicate poetic art. But in 1797, an official named Yamada Asamon V published a highly influential book ranking the greatest swordsmiths in history.
A ranking of the masters. Okay, how did he judge them? Was it by the beauty of the Hammond or like the elegance of the curve?
No, Yamada's metric wasn't beauty at all. His metric was raw cutting ability. And Yamada wasn't an art critic. He was the official executioner for the shogunate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He tested these legendary, beautifully crafted, poetic works of art by taking the torsos of executed human beings, stacking them directly on top of each other, and seeing how many bodies the katana could cleanly chop through in a single fluid swing.
Seriously?
Yes. Some swords were ranked by their ability to cut through 2, 3, or even 4 bodies at once.
That is incredibly visceral. It completely shatters the sterile museum glass we usually view these through.
It really does. It forces a difficult realization. I have to ask, how did a society reconcile the delicate, poetic appreciation of stars and mist with the brutal, uncompromising reality of what this object was actually built to do? The next time you see a katana, remember that behind the polished beauty is a history of profound violence and brilliant, uncompromising science.
It is the ultimate collision of form and function. The stars, the mist, and the strike. Definitely something to think about the next time you see that iconic curved blade shining on the silver screen.